Now that we are familiar with sampling techniques, let's take a look at some of the sampling problems we may come across and how to minimize them. So first of all, it's important to understand that different samples might give different results, which is completely normal. Just like when we talked about simulations, if I ran the simulation in a different way, I might get different results, and that's expected, but over the long run, as that number gets higher and higher, we would expect things to even out. Same thing happens when I'm dealing here with sampling. So if I get different results, it's just called sampling variability, and it's to be expected, but we're trying to reduce that variability as much as we can. So if I design my method poorly, I'm going to invite bias, and there's going to be a lot of variability. And so I want to reduce the bias as much as I can. One bias is called voluntary response bias, and we've actually talked about this a little bit ago. If I gave a survey and just said, hey, respond if you want to, and chose only people who volunteered, I'm probably going to end up with the most opinionated people because they're the people who have the most to say. For example, each term BU sends out emails to all students enrolled in every class they're enrolled in, asking them to answer questions about the university, the class, the professor. Only about 3% of students respond to those surveys, and I can tell you either those surveys are very, very nice or not so nice. So it includes only people who are very opinionated. Convenience sampling. In convenience sampling, we include responses from anybody that I can easily include responses from. But this is not a good idea because we're likely to include people who are more like us, or people who look safe, or just people in general who don't really represent the population. I obviously am an instructor, and so if I only talk to people who are taking math courses on campus and I'm looking at the population of all students at BU, well, then I'm missing out on all of the people who, don't have to take math because they've already taken it. I'm missing out on all the people who take online classes because they're not on campus, and so that would be a bad idea to do convenience sampling because I wouldn't be including a representative sample. A bad sampling frame. If I have a bad sampling frame, I'm not including all types of people in the population in my sampling frame, which means I might be missing people in prison, homeless people, students, people who are stationed overseas. So the sampling frame is essentially the group of people from which you're able to draw a sample. And if I'm not including a whole group of people because they're in prison or because they're homeless or because they're students or military, etc., then that is called a bad sampling frame. Undercoverage is essentially a result of a bad sampling frame, which means that I have left out some part of the population. In addition to examples that we looked at before, say I'm giving a door-to-door survey, but I'm doing it during the daytime, then I'm going to miss out on people who work during the day or who are rarely at home. If I give a sample in English, obviously people maybe who don't speak English will not be able to respond to that survey. And then we have non-response bias. So non-response bias occurs when people are given the opportunity to respond but don't. So it's better to ensure that you have a smaller group of subjects respond rather than put the survey out to a large number of people and only receive a small number of responses in return. Non-response bias possibly happens, and I can tell you from experience, if someone calls me and says, hey, I want you to do this survey and it's only going to take about 45 minutes of your time, I'm out. I'm not going to spend 45 minutes with you. Response bias, we're going to look at in just a second, but that is where questions are made to influence your response. Or questions that ask for information people aren't willing to give. If people start asking for your social security number or your weight or your income or your date of birth, etc., people may not be so happy to answer your survey. So just keep that in mind, that if you were to create a survey, make sure that you're not creating a survey that people are going to choose not to respond to. And response bias. Response bias, again, is framing a question in such a way that it invites a particular response. So, an example, Kobe Bryant makes more money in a single year than all of the professors at Bellevue University combined. Do you believe Kobe Bryant is overpaid or underpaid? Or, Kobe Bryant is responsible for bringing in over $1 billion to the organizations he works for. However, he only keeps 3% of this money. Do you believe Kobe Bryant is underpaid or overpaid? So obviously, the one that I wrote first about Bellevue University, I'm saying, man, this guy is overpaid. He makes so much money. But if I write it this way, then I'm basically giving a bias because I'm encouraging you to say underpaid. So that is response bias.